This is a quilt that I've had in my mind to make for a long time now, and I'm really excited to show you how to do it. Today we're going to be making the Confetti Hearts quilt, which this is actually a design that I sketched in my journal a while back and I just never got around to, and I'm super excited to have it made and share it with you today. It's super quick and easy, so let me show you how we do this. So to make this quilt, you're going to need one package of 10-inch squares, and I use this adorable line called XOXO by Heather Lee Chan for Clothworks. It's just such a great Valentine's collection. I think you're really going to like it. You're also going to need 3 3/4 yards of background fabric, and that is it. So let's dive into the construction of this. So this quilt actually has 3 blocks. We're going to have this large heart block, just a single heart, and then there are 2 opposite blocks with the small hearts, and so you can see how these are the opposites. And then all we're going to do besides that is set these with our 8.5-inch background squares. So we're going to begin by making this big heart block. So we're going to take our 10-inch square, and I'm just going to set this on my mat. And you do want to pay attention if you have directional fabric, which this is directional. And so I'm going to begin by cutting off a 4.5-inch strip from the bottom of my 10-inch square. So I'll just line this up here and make a cut. And then I can set this aside for a moment and make another 4.5-inch cut. There we go, and we'll set this piece aside. And then now from this bottom piece, I'm going to trim this so that it measures 4.5 by 8.5. So let's go ahead and count over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.5. And we will make that cut. And then from our other rectangle, we need 2 4.5-inch squares. Let me make sure this is nice and straight on my mat, and then we can make these cuts as well. So there's 1 and 2. So not too much waste from our 10-inch square. That's all we won't be using. And now let's talk about our background fabric. I have 2 4.5-inch background squares. You can see on this one I have drawn the line corner to corner, and we are going to begin by setting this on our large rectangle and sewing right on that line, and then we're going to do the same thing on the opposite side so that it overlaps. So let's go ahead and take this to the sewing machine. And remember, we are looking to sew right on that line, not next to it. There's the first one. So now I'll go ahead and trim this off, leaving just a 1/4 inch seam allowance. There we go. Now let's take this over and give it a good press. Just roll that back. And now we're going to set our other 4.5-inch square on the opposite side. And you can see here that it overlaps that first seam that we made. I didn't draw the line on this one because I can just use my diagonal seam tape, but if you wanted to, you would draw it point to point this way, and so right on that line. So let's go ahead and do that. There we go. We can trim this one off as well. Again, leaving that 1/4 inch seam allowance, that's what we're looking for. Now, if you wanted to, these are pretty decent size half square triangles, so you could absolutely sew another seam line here and use those for another project. I didn't plan anything with those for this, but just keep that in mind. There we go. Now the bottom half of our heart is done. And let's move on to the top. So it's the same idea, except for I'm going to use my 4.5-inch squares, and I have 2¼ inch background squares here. And the reason that I did this is I decided that I didn't want them to overlap because that gives a little bit more curve to the top of the heart instead of it being really sharp and pointy. So I can actually set both of these on my square at the same time, and I can sew on this line and then come back and sew on this line. So let's do that, and we're going to do the same thing on both pieces. There's one. Now I'll just make sure the second background square is nice and straight on here. So down the other way. So you can see the first one looks just like that. We'll do the same thing here. And our other background square, and so right on that line. Also saves you a little bit of time at the sewing machine because you can do all of those seams before you have to come and trim. So let's trim off our seam allowance again. One more cut. And now we can take these and press them. Same thing, we're just going to roll back our background fabric. There's one, kind of flipped up, so I'm just going to make sure it lays nice and flat. And one more. Perfect. Okay, so now we have all the pieces of our heart. So I'm going to begin by sewing these two together. So I'll put these right sides together and take a 1/4 inch seam. I do like to kind of make sure my heart is lined up there in the center. So I come to that point and then finish off the rest of my seam. There we go. Now we can press this back. And add the bottom piece. All right, now we can press this, and our first block for this quilt is done. There is our 8.5 inch heart block. So now let's make the small hearts. All right, to make the small hearts that you see in our other blocks, we are going to also use our 10-inch squares, and we're going to cut those into 4 5-inch squares to begin with. So I'm going to cut this in half both directions. 1 and 2. And then I mixed all of these up, so you can see I wanted it to be like a smattering of confetti. And so I didn't use any of the same prints in the blocks together, but I did, cut them up, mix them up, and just grab from the pile. And so now we can take our 5-inch square, and we're going to cut this in half again. so that we have a rectangle that is 2.5 by 5, and I'm going to take this and trim this down to 2.5 by 4.5. So I am going to cut just a 1/2 inch off one side. And then from this side, I am just going to cut this in half so that we have two 2.5 inch squares. So make sure I've got this nice and straight. And then we have this ready to go. And so these are the pieces that you're going to need to make your small hearts, as well as 1 1/4 inch background squares and 2.5 inch background squares. And so it's the exact same idea as the large heart, just with smaller pieces. So let's go ahead and make this. We're going to begin by making the bottom side of our heart. So it's the same thing that we did before. I've drawn my line corner to corner, and we're going to line this up on our heart bottom, and so right on the line. There's that first one. And now remember, on the bottom of the heart, you do need to trim in between, adding the two sides. So we're going to cut this piece off, and you can either finger press or take this to the iron. I am going to go ahead and hit it with the iron just because I like it to be nice and crisp. And then now we can add that other 2.5 inch square going in the opposite direction. And so again, we want to make sure it's intersecting that first seam that we took. And we're going to sew right on that line. And just trim and press. I love quilts like this because the steps kind of become repetitive, but then you can just get in the motion and just really enjoy the process. So now the bottom of our little heart is done, and let's do the top. So we have our little 1 1/4 inch squares, and we're going to do the exact same thing we did on the larger version and just sew right on that line. And then we can add another background square going down the other way. There's the first one, and we'll do one more. Okay, just want to make sure that's lined up with the corner of your square. And add the last right there. Okay, so now once we have those two sewn, we can trim those as well. And this is just tiny little triangles you have to cut off here. There we go. Let's give these a press. All right, and now we can assemble these small hearts. So all of this is the exact same. Like I said, we're going to begin by sewing the two top halves together, making sure that center point of our heart is lined up, sewing that with a 1/4 inch seam. Now we can open that up, give it a little press, match these together, and finish making our little hearts. I love this little block. It's just so quick and so fun. There we go. Now we can press it. All right, now let's show you how you make the two versions. So I have all of my pieces here. I have another little heart that I made, and I have some 4.5-inch background squares. And so remember, these are the 2 small blocks that we're looking for. So in one version, we start with I'm starting here with this one. We start with a heart up and in the left and down and in the right. And then our background squares go opposite. And then when it's sewn together, it looks like this. And then for our other one, we just flip-flop this. Up on the right, down on the left, and then we get a block that looks like that. And so let's take a minute and go over to the quilt, and I'll show you how this all comes together. All right, so here on the design wall, you can see the completed quilt, and you'll notice the opposite blocks that we worked on. But I want to point out, you're just going to want to follow the diagram on laying this out, but there is a little helpful tip that will make it much easier for you. When you are making your rows, this entire row, the top row, uses only the A block of the small hearts, and it alternates. So then the next row is entirely the B blocks of the small hearts. And it just keeps going down the quilt. And so you'll know if you have opposite quilts in a row, you have something off. So just keep that in mind. It comes together really quickly, and it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 by 9 down. The quilt measures 64 by 70, and I did this all over quilting with heart blossoms here from our Missouri Star Machine Quilting Department, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on the Confetti Hearts quilt. I'll see you next time on At Home. Hey everyone, it's Misty. Thanks for watching At Home. If you aren't already a part of our Missouri Star family, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell if you want a notification every time we release a new video. I'll see you next Monday on the newest episode of At Home.